This is a photograph of Vice President Lyndon Johnson being sworn in on the presidential plane, Air Force One, just a few hours after President Kennedy was assassinated. And he has two women on either side of him. One is his wife, Lady Bird, and the other is actually Kennedy's widow, Jacqueline Kennedy. Um, so he is sworn in, and just 5 days later, he goes before Congress and he gives a speech in which he urges Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill that President Kennedy had been pushing for so that his death would not be in vain. Now, this is Lyndon Johnson being the politician that he is. Johnson is never going to pass up an opportunity, and he knows that he can use Kennedy's death and Kennedy's memory to get the bill that Kennedy himself was not able to pass through Congress. In August 1964, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act, and Johnson signs it into law. Now, what does this law do exactly? One, it bans segregation in public places. Public businesses no longer can refuse service based on race, gender, religion, or national origin. Also, businesses can not discriminate when it comes to who they hire based on race, gender, or national origin. And it gives the federal government the power to enforce this law. Now, if you look at the photograph, you can see Martin Luther King in the background. This was a big day for him, and Johnson gave one of the pens that he signed the bill with to MLK as a gift. Once segregation had been officially banned by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the civil rights movement turned its attention to the right to vote. So now that segregation is done away with, they're going to focus on their voting rights. Think back to the end of Reconstruction. Ever since the end of Reconstruction, the South had been working to deprive African Americans of the right to vote, using things like poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, so on and so forth. Well, in 1964, Congress passed the 24th Amendment, which officially eliminated poll taxes in federal elections. So from that point forward, if it is a national election that's the president you're voting for or a member of Congress, then poll taxes cannot be used. But it actually does not do anything for state elections. So if you're voting for governor or city council, poll taxes could technically still be used. Also in 1964, the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, started what was known as Freedom Summer. They sent workers into Mississippi, which they considered to be probably the most racist state in the South, and began registering African Americans to vote. Many of these workers were met with violence, and in a very infamous case, 3 of the civil rights workers were kidnapped and murdered, and their car was burned up. But the most famous event in the struggle for voting rights was the events that took place in Selma. So Martin Luther King led a demonstration to Selma, Alabama. and it was decided that they would march 50 miles from Selma to the Alabama capital at Montgomery. As they were leaving town, the sheriff, Jim Clark, and his deputies were waiting for them on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And they ordered them to stop and turn back. They were not willing to allow them to march to the Capitol. The protesters stopped, but they did not leave. They simply knelt down and began to pray. And the police simply started to beat them with billy clubs and whatever else. Just like in Birmingham, this was captured on film, and this outraged the nation. And within a few months, Congress had passed a second Civil Rights Act. This one was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law officially ended poll taxes and literacy tests on the federal and the state level. It also allowed the federal government to send agents to register voters. So typically, if you register the vote, you go to the post office. And what the government is threatening to do with the Voting Rights Act is to send an agent to your town to register voters for you. If you are not going to accept someone who's trying to register to vote, we'll send somebody to do it for you. Don't make us have to do that. Now, once the Voting Rights Act was passed, it was somewhat unclear exactly what direction the civil rights movement was going to move. And there's going to be some conflicts within the movement because of this. Now, the Civil Rights Acts that Johnson signed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was just a small part of Johnson's social program, which he called the Great Society. Now, the main part of the Great Society was the War on Poverty. Johnson had grown up fairly poor. And as a young man, he had briefly worked as a teacher in South Texas. And most of his students had been poor Mexican-American children. So, in his heart, Johnson truly felt sympathy for the poor. And he wanted to be the president who ended poverty in America. And so, a major part of his war on poverty is the Economic Opportunity Act, which establishes a series of programs to help create jobs, and the Job Corps, which was made up of volunteers, usually young Americans, who would go into parts of the United States that were really stricken with poverty and would offer training to impoverished young Americans that would help them secure jobs in the future. So the more training you have, the more likely you're able to find a job. So that was the thinking behind the Job Corps. The Medicare Act. This was another extension on Social Security. So this is providing medical care for the elderly, specifically American citizens over the age of 65. Johnson managed to create a new cabinet position, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the gentleman that he chose to head that cabinet position, his name I am forgetting, but he was actually the first African American to ever serve on a presidential cabinet. And lastly, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is the law that Johnson is signing in the photograph to the left. The lady you see sitting next to him is his old teacher. And the building behind him is the school that he attended. That is in Johnson City, Texas. He truly believed that education was, if not the cure, definitely an enemy of poverty. If you're educated, you're more likely to find a good job. So Johnson, he's waging war on poverty, and he does manage to lower the poverty rate in the nation by around 12%. The problem is that the war in Vietnam is starting to get out of hand, and he's having to spend more money fighting the war that he could be using on his Great Society programs. So Johnson, he simply wants to get out of Vietnam, but he knows that if he does that, that will make the United States appear to be weak. And this is the Cold War. He's trying to stop communism from spreading. So simply leaving Vietnam is not an option for Lyndon Johnson. Instead, he thinks, if I can just send in the troops, clean house, and get out, then that's probably my best option. So Johnson begins looking for an opportunity to send more soldiers to Vietnam. And in August of 1964, an American ship reports that it had been attacked by a North Vietnamese torpedo boat. To this day, it is not clear if this ship was actually attacked, but this became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, named after the spot where this attack took place. Just a few days later, LBJ, or Congress, passed a law known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and this allowed Johnson to use whatever power and to take whatever action he thought was necessary in Vietnam. So once Congress gave him the power to essentially do whatever he wanted in Vietnam, Johnson began to escalate the war. First, he began what was known as Operation Rolling Thunder. This was a massive bombing campaign of Vietnam, and ultimately the United States would drop more explosives on Vietnam than it dropped on both Germany and Japan in World War II. Now, in order to bomb North Vietnam, the United States needed air bases in South Vietnam. And it needs somebody to protect those air bases. So in 1965, the first American combat troops began to arrive in Vietnam. So this is the first time that American soldiers have actually arrived in Vietnam specifically to fight. Up until this time, they've just been there to help train the South Vietnamese army, but now they're there to actually fight. And they develop what is known as search and destroy. So the tactic in Vietnam is not to capture territory, it's to kill as many of the enemy as possible. This started after the Battle of Ia Drang Valley, where around 200 Americans were killed and around 3,000 Vietnamese were killed. And this is where the U.S. gets the idea that, hey, let's just kill as many Vietnamese as possible. So Johnson begins to increase the number of troops in Vietnam, and he does this by drafting them.